welcome to this explainer. We usually think of reading and listening as totally passive. You just sit back and absorb the words, right? Well, linguist Michael Hoey says absolutely not. He argues it is actually a super dynamic, interactive, cognitive puzzle that we're unconsciously solving every single time we process language. So today, we're going to explore the hidden mechanics of how we actually make sense of texts. Okay, let's jump straight into his foundational text On the Surface of Discourse. Published back in 1983, this book's whole goal is to totally demystify exactly how we construct and interpret meaning when we read and write. Hoey basically wanted to figure out what gives a bunch of sentences texture and coherence, pulling discourse analysis right out of the fringes and putting it at the absolute center of how communication works.
The absolute crux of his argument relies on this brilliant analogy. The sentence is only a small cog in a normally much larger machine. Think about it. In school, we're taught to obsess over sentence grammar, but sentences don't exist in a vacuum. They are working gears driving a much bigger mechanism. And it's our job in discourse analysis to figure out exactly how that machine runs and how all those tiny linguistic cogs interlock.
Let's actually test that theory right now. I want you to play discourse detective for a second. Do you have an instinctive knowledge of discourse? Can you instinctively sense the rules of this machine without ever being explicitly taught them? Well, Hoey says yes. He argues that everyday language users possess this massive, unstated ability to just kind of know how a text should be put together. To prove it, he brings up this really cool experiment by Dr. Eugene Winter called the Icy Roads test. They took a bunch of university science students, we're talking computer science, chemistry, and engineering kids in their very first week of college, and gave them a completely jumbled set of 10 sentences about how different countries handle icy roads. The task was simple: reconstruct the text into its proper order in just 20 minutes. Incredibly, 55% of these students perfectly or near perfectly unjumbled the whole thing. And remember, these were science students with literally zero formal linguistic training. Hoey points to this as proof that native speakers share this innate consensus about how information is organized. They didn't need a rulebook for the machine. Their brains just instinctively knew how to assemble the gears. On the flip side, Hoey looks at a game called Serious Consequences to show us what happens when that machine actually breaks. Imagine taking the classic gentle opening of a Hans Andersen fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a merchant, and smashing it right up against a line from a completely different, rigid Robert Graves story. The principal met her at the front door. Your brain instantly rebels, doesn't it? You immediately recognize that the expected formula is totally broken. So now that we've seen how you already instinctively get these rules, let's take a quick look at our agenda for this explainer. We're covering the hidden discourse machine, discovering clause relations, the problem-solution pattern, modifying the basic pattern, matching and complex patterns, and finally, the reader-writer dialogue. All right, jumping right into Section 2, discovering clause relations and debunking the brick myth. To really grasp this machine, we've got to toss out this old clunky theory. For a long time, some linguists believed in the brick-by-brick theory, the idea that sentences are just stacked next to each other like bricks in a wall, linked only by basic things like pronouns or repetition. But Hoey says no way. He advocates for clause relation theory. He defines a clause relation as a cognitive process where we interpret the meaning of a sentence specifically in light of the sentences right next to it. Meaning isn't just sitting there in the words. It is cognitively added by you, the reader, when you put the pieces together. Which brings us to Section 3, the problem-solution pattern, or what Hoey calls a minimum discourse. Let's look at his most famous framework using a minimum discourse example devised by Eugene Winter. It goes exactly like this. 1. I was on sentry duty. 2. I saw the enemy approaching. 3. I opened fire. 4. I beat off the attack. Now, this tiny micro-narrative sounds perfectly normal to our ears, right? Why? Because its specific sequence maps flawlessly onto our brain's innate expectations of how a story should unfold. Let's break down exactly why this works. Step 1 is the situation. By saying, I was on sentry duty, the writer is laying down the background. It gives us the exact contextual setting we need before the real action kicks off. Next up, we hit the problem. I saw the enemy approaching. This completely shatters that initial calm situation. Hoey defines the problem as an aspect of the situation that absolutely demands a response. It's the engine that forces the narrative forward. Naturally, that leads to the response. I opened fire.
This is the specific action taken to deal with that exact problem, because our brains naturally expect that once a problem pops up, a response absolutely has to follow. And finally, we get the evaluation. I beat off the attack. This tells us how successful the response was, capping off a super satisfying logical sequence. If you were to scramble these 4 steps, the text would sound totally weird or just completely unacceptable. This sequence, situation, problem, response, evaluation, is a deeply ingrained, non-negotiable pattern in English discourse. Moving right along to Section 4, modifying the basic pattern with lexical signaling. Obviously, real-world writing is way more complex than a 4-sentence story about sentry duty. So how do our brains track this pattern in the wild? Well, writers actively drop clues. In an example about dropping freight from helicopters and building an aerotrain, Hoey shows how specific words act like literal neon signposts. The word problems or a phrase like has to be cushioned screams at the reader, hey, we're in the problem phase. A phrase like to avoid this is amazing because it's a 2-armed signpost. It points backward to the problem we want to avoid and forward, guiding our brains straight to the response phase. Hoey calls this lexical signaling, and it's exactly how writers guide our cognitive expectations.
Section 5, matching patterns, specifically compatibility and contrast.
Beyond just sequential logic like problems and solutions, Hoey highlights matching relations. Take a look at this. Fred drove his car slowly versus Ted drove his car fast. Notice that intense syntactic repetition? The grammar is almost identical. Hoey argues this isn't lazy writing at all, it's a super deliberate framing device. By keeping the old information structurally exactly the same, the brand new contrasting details, Fred versus Ted and slowly versus fast, completely pop out at you.
And finally, Section 6, the reader-writer dialogue. This is honestly one of Hoey's most profound insights. He argues that every piece of written monologue is secretly a projected dialogue between the writer and the reader. When you're scanning a text, you aren't just passively downloading data. You are subconsciously formulating expectations and asking internal questions about what comes next. And if the writer anticipates those questions correctly, smooth reading. If they don't, you stumble and comprehension slows down. To prove this, Hoey uses an example of a politician, Mr. Wilson, winning middle-class votes. When you read that he won those votes, your brain implicitly asks, wait, how did he achieve this? So when the very next sentence says, he appealed to scientists and technologists, it feels incredibly satisfying because it's directly answering that invisible question you literally just asked in your head. All of this builds to Hoey's grand conclusion. Discourse is a complex network. It's not just a straight line. Because a clause relation can theoretically connect any sentence to any other sentence or answer a question posed pages ago, a discourse is this vast, intricate web of meaning. It is not a flat row of bricks, it's a huge 3-dimensional network of cognitive connections. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to chew on. Look back at the highly structured path we just traversed together. How did your own cognitive expectations shape your understanding of this very analysis? What implicit questions were you asking yourself, and what hidden signals did I use to guide you? The next time you read or listen to anything, take a second to notice that hidden machine humming right beneath the surface. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into Michael Hoey's brilliant framework.